Hey everyone, it's Mark and I'm back today with another PMDG 737 tutorial, and this time I'm going to be looking at the hardest part of flying this airplane, which is getting it back down to the ground in one piece with an ILS approach. This video continues from where the last video left off at cruise. If you need any help on how to prepare the flight deck, starting the engines, or even how to get up to this altitude, you can check out the previous videos in this series, but otherwise let's just get right into what you're here for. I'm going to start off with a really quick briefing of what to expect, since it's going to be a similar process regardless of what flight you're doing. From cruise, we're going to start by following an arrival procedure, or a STAR, which at its core is really just a whole bunch of waypoints that are put together in a certain way that you have to follow with your autopilot's LNAV. In our case, we're flying the Wounds 2 arrival that we loaded into the FMC in the previous video. It starts out at the ORW waypoint, and then it goes by a bunch more waypoints on its way to the end of the procedure at Wounds. There aren't any altitude restrictions listed for any of the waypoints on this chart, but it's pretty typical to either have a minimum altitude or maximum altitude for some of those waypoints, and in that case you want to make sure that the numbers that are on the chart match up to what's shown on the right hand side of each waypoint. If one of the altitudes in the FMC doesn't match up to what you're seeing on the chart, you can just change it by entering the new altitude into the scratch pad and pressing next to whatever waypoint that you want to load it into. Somewhere along the arrival procedure, we're also going to reach our top of descent, which is where we're going to start descending from cruise. And once we reach the end of the arrival at Wounds, we're going to transition onto the approach. It's another 34 nautical miles from Wounds to the airport, and on the chart there aren't any details on how to get to the beginning of the approach, but if we look at the bottom, you can see that it says to expect radar vectors to final, which basically means that ATC would be guiding us to the beginning of the approach. There are two ways that you can handle this if you're flying without ATC. The first is to make your flight go from the last waypoint of the arrival to the first waypoint of the approach by removing the discontinuity. But that doesn't really work because you'd end up way too close to the ILS's flight path, and the plane wouldn't have enough room to turn around, descend, and slow down on time to make the runway. The best way to do it is just to leave the discontinuity as is, and once you get to the end of the arrival, just give yourself a vector with heading select that's going to run parallel to the runway that you're landing on, and keep going until you're abeam the first waypoint of the approach. At that point, you can fly just a little bit further past it, and then turn to intercept the final approach course and follow the approach procedure all the way down to the runway. We're going to get back to the video in just a minute, but I want to remind you before we get any further to make sure to hit the like button if you haven't already. Your likes and subscribes are what keep the channel growing and what keeps me motivated to make more videos for you. So make sure to do that and subscribe as well so that you don't miss out on future videos. Alright, our autopilot is still in VNAV, and we're coming up on the beginning of the arrival now, and just ahead on the navigation display you can see our top of descent marker in green is showing us where the plane's calculated needs to start coming down from cruise. The exact location of the top of descent marker is based on the target speed that's entered on the descent page in the FMC. But it's also based on the wind conditions, and to get an accurate VNAV profile you have to provide it with all of the winds along your descent route. So I'll do that now by going into forecasts. You're going to want to enter the details that are shown in the descent block under the wind information section of the SimBrief OFP. For each entry you're going to want to enter the altitude on the left hand side, and you can just do that with flight levels by just entering the first 3 digits. And then on the right side, you're going to want to enter the wind direction and speed and just separate those with a slash. For my flight, since I'm cruising at 21,000 feet only, I'm going to enter the winds for flight level 200, 150, and 100. But if you're higher up, you're also going to want to enter the number for flight level 310 just so that the airplane has the complete picture of the descent. If we go up to the descent page now, you can see it's updated its information on how long it's going to be to our top of descent, and that's pretty much all the information it needs. So now let's go ahead and enter our approach information by going to the ref page. The first thing I'm going to do is pick my flap setting, which is pretty much always going to be flaps 30. And all I've got to do is select it on the right hand side and then load it in just a couple of rows below that. The ILS frequency and the course are shown here as well, and that of course matches what I have on my approach chart for the ILS to runway 27. I need to set that in two places on the bottom pedestal, both on the pilot side and the co-pilot side. It needs to be set to that frequency of 111.3, and you're going to want to make sure to swap them into the active frequency on both sides as well. We've also got to tune the inbound course of 272 again, both on the pilot side and the co-pilot side. Otherwise, the autopilot is going to complain that it's got disagreeing information. And again, it's just as simple as twisting the knobs to the right value. The runway length is 7,000 feet, which isn't short, but it's not super long either, and I rather err on the side of caution, so I'm going to turn the auto brakes to 3 just to make sure that we stop in plenty of time. With that done, we've programmed everything that we need for both our descent and approach, and all we've got to do now is wait until we reach our top of descent. Alright, we're coming up on the top of descent marker just ahead, and with the plane still in VNAV, it's going to automatically start descending for me on its pre-calculated profile. But for that to happen, I need to lower the altitude on the autopilot before we reach the top of the descent marker. So I'm going to set it to 6,000 feet since that's the level off altitude for the beginning of the approach. It's not the end of the world if you accidentally passed your top of descent point without reducing your altitude first. If that happens, just lower your altitude exactly like I just did, but you're going to notice the plane won't start descending, and what you've got to do is press the altitude intervent button on the MCP for it to start following the VNAV profile again. As we go by the top of the descent, the PFD is going to update itself to tell us that the engines are spooling down for the descent, and our vertical mode is going to stay as VPAT, and our altitude should start slowly dropping too. The descent page also updated itself with all of the details of our descent. It's aiming to be at 6,000 feet when it reaches AB with a speed of 0.72 Mach. And just like for cruise, you can change both of those values if you really want to, although the defaults that it comes up with are generally pretty good. As the plane's descending, it's continually adjusting the descent path so that it reaches the target altitude at the right speed. And on the bottom right of the navigation display, you can see the vertical deviation scale shows you how far off you actually are from that calculated VNAV path. This scale works exactly like the glide slope of an ILS. The diamond represents that ideal glide path that you should be on. The center of the scale is where the airplane is. So if you're above the glide path, you're going to see the diamond's going to be below the center of the scale and vice versa. Alright, we're approaching the end of the Wounds 2 arrival now, and we need to make our way to the beginning of the approach, even though we've got that route discontinuity still. LNAV is going to disable itself automatically once it reaches the last waypoint and it runs into the discontinuity, because it doesn't know where to go next, and to make sure that you notice it, it's also going to turn an autopilot warning light that you can just reset by pressing it. What I'll do from here is assume that ATC gave me a vector to follow, something like American 2707, turn right heading 090, and at that point I would just set that in the heading selector and enable heading select just to keep flying parallel to that approach path for runway 27 like we said in the briefing. Technically the runway is on a heading of 272, and if you want to make sure that you're not drifting any closer to the ILS's flight path because of the current winds, you can see your track across the ground shown right at the top of the navigation display, and if you wanted to stay truly parallel, you could just adjust your track to fly a course of 092 instead. I'm also going to stay in VNAV for now, mostly because it's going to handle slowing us down in a just-in-time sort of way. But you should still keep an eye on it because the profile might not be 100% accurate since we've got that discontinuity in our flight plan. There isn't a ton to do at this point because we did all of our descent planning earlier, but this is usually the point in the flight where I'm going to double check everything, especially the ILS frequency and the course, since both of those need to be set right for us to have any hope at landing. If for whatever reason the airplane ends up high on profile and it needs some help to reach its altitude and airspeed targets, you're going to get a drag required message on the FMC and a little warning light on the center instrument panel as well to tell you that you need to intervene to maintain the correct profile. During the descent, you're usually still at around 0.7 Mach or more, so your only real option at that point is to extend the speed brakes to increase the amount of drag, which is going to reduce your airspeed, and like that the plane will be able to increase its descent rate and still maintain that target airspeed. We're coming up on 10,000 feet now, and you can see that the airspeed has been slowly bleeding itself off as I continue to descend. The reason that's happening is because of the speed restriction on the descent page. It says that we should slow down to 240 knots at 10,000 feet, which is the speed limit under that altitude, but you could always change these values if you wanted to as well. The VNAV isn't descending anywhere near as fast as it was earlier, but it will keep going even though our flight plan is a little bit wonky at the moment without that routing information to the next waypoint. The other option that you can go for if you want a little bit more control over your descent is to switch to vertical speed to reach your target altitude a little bit faster, especially since there aren't any restrictions along this segment of the route. I'm going to use it now just so I can show you how vertical speed works, and the moment you turn it on, it's going to match whatever vertical speed the plane's currently descending at, and then you can adjust it with the up and down controls. The airspeed knob also came alive once we switched to vertical speed, so you can control that too, but within certain limits, right? It's going to respect the vertical speed that you tell it first, and it's going to do its best to match the speed that you've set, but you might have to help it out again with speed brakes and flaps. If you're ever wondering when you can extend flaps in the 737, there's a neat little table printed right under the landing gear lever that you can use just as a really quick reference. But a good rule of thumb that I've heard if you need to burn off a lot of excess speed is to go to flaps 5 and bring the speed brakes about halfway out. We're still flying parallel to the final approach path. We're about 10 nautical miles offset to the south, and we're just abeam the AB waypoint now. So I'm just going to keep flying on this course a little bit longer before turning towards final. It's best to go a little bit past the abeam point just so that we aren't doing a 90-degree turn onto final, and I found it works best if you start your inbound turn just as that waypoint is falling off the bottom of the display. We're about there now, and there's two ways that you can go about doing this. What would happen if you were flying with ATC is that tell you to turn to a heading of around 340 until you're established on the localizer, because that's going to be about a 45-degree angle towards the final approach course. And that's what I'm going to do here by just changing my heading on the heading selector. And since I'm already in heading mode, it's just going to start turning right away. The other option is to go into the legs page on the FMC and update the flight plan to go direct to the first waypoint of the approach. To do that, you just press once to load the next waypoint, which is the AB waypoint, into the scratch pad, and then put it right at the top of the route and execute that change once it prompts you to. Now the autopilot knows where it has to go, so if I wanted to, I could re-enable LNAV and just let the plane get me there on its own, but I usually prefer to just stay in heading select, have a little bit more fun handling the plane myself. The other thing to note is that the plane's leveled off at 6,000 feet now, and it automatically came out of vertical speed once it reached its target altitude, and it switched into altitude hold, which is what we're going to stay in until we intercept the glide slope. Managing this part of the approach and your airspeed down to the runway is the trickiest part of landing this airplane, and until you've got a few landings under your belt, it can feel a little bit intimidating. But if all you're going to do is practice this part, make sure that you check out my quick start video, because it's going to give you a really quick way to just practice your landings. My biggest tip though, if you're struggling, is to stay ahead of the curve by slowing the plane down early. Most of my troubles early on were because I had excess airspeed pretty much in every phase of flight. So if you can control that by slowing down just a little bit earlier than you need to, you should be in pretty good shape. With regards to that though, just remember that the speed brakes can't work miracles, especially on final. They don't seem to be as effective as they are at higher altitudes and airspeeds. So it's really all about controlling your airspeed ahead of time with the autopilot's airspeed knob. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . Speaking of airspeed, I've slowed down to 220 now for exactly that reason. And if we look at the primary flight display, you can see the landing system isn't showing me the localizer or the glide slope of the ILS yet. Sometimes it's a bit slow to pick it up, but once the localizer diamond appears at the bottom of the primary flight display, you can enable Vorlock, and that's going to tell the airplane to capture the localizer and turn to fly the final approach course. A mistake that I was making was turning the approach mode on too early. You should really only press that button once the glide slope appears on the right hand side of the PFD. Otherwise, it's going to go into another mode and you're going to end up causing yourself a whole lot of trouble. Alright, the localizer is coming in now and we're starting our last turn towards final, and now that we're going by the initial approach fix waypoint, I can bring the altitude down even further to the final approach fix altitude, which is usually going to be marked on the chart with either an X or the letters FAF right next to it, and for this approach it's at 1700 feet at the Ripid waypoint. The next thing to look for is for the glide slope to come alive on the right hand side of the PFD. And I'm already almost on it now that it has, so I'm going to switch into approach mode at this point. And you can see once I've done that in the PFD, it now says that the active mode in green is glide slope, which is the correct setting that we're looking for, so we should start descending any second now. This is the point where it's time to start configuring for landing, and right now I'm flying at 220 knots with no flaps, and I need to get down to my VREF speed of about 150 knots with the flaps at 30, the speed brakes armed, and the gear down. To achieve that, I'm going to incrementally extend the flaps and slow the plane down with the airspeed knob in about 10 knot increments, wait for it to slow down, and then do it again all the way down to my final approach speed. The only things to be careful of are a flaps overspeed, so just keep an eye on the red section of the airspeed indicator as you're slowing down. And once you go to flaps 15, just make sure that you've brought the gear down as well to avoid the horn going off on you, because there's no real way to stop it until the gear is down and locked. You can also use the speed brakes here if you have some excess speed, but if you do everything correctly, you shouldn't really need them, and you'll want to make sure to reset them to the armed position before landing so they deploy automatically on touchdown. The gear can come down anywhere between 5 and 10 nautical miles, but I usually err on the higher side just because it's another source of drag to help slow the airplane down, and that's never a bad thing when you're coming into land. You want to fly the last part of final, so from the final approach fix to the runway threshold at VREF plus 10. Which is easy enough to figure out by just looking at where the VREF mark is on the airspeed indicator, and you can turn the airspeed knob so the purple caret is just 10 knots above that. Once you're ready, you can disable the autopilot, and for the auto throttle, first make sure that you've brought your throttles back to close to around a quarter of their travel, and once you disable the auto thrust, move them ever so slightly just so that you can see where the engine is going to react and put the N1 percentage at. You're looking to have around 60 to 65% on the N1 as you're descending. The plane is pretty stable even in moderate winds, but it can be a little bit of a challenge the first few times regardless, and as you get closer and closer to the threshold, you can reduce throttle ever so slightly to get down to your VREF speed as you're crossing over the threshold, which should be at around 50 to 55% N1. The 737 is really low to the ground, and because of that you barely need to flare as you're getting close to touching down. Just hold your attitude and the main gear should touch down first, and then you can gently bring the nose down and go into reverse thrust at the same time. If you got to this point in the video, please make sure to hit the like button if you haven't already, and subscribe as well so you don't miss out on the next videos in this PMDG 737 series.